conceived. And he wanted the planning department to look at the relations between infill development and stormwater runoff complaints. So we assembled a team from planning, codes, and water services to formulate some key tasks and questions to be answered. From planning, we had Lisa Milligan, myself, Katie Kamizis, and Kelsey Gowdy. From codes, we had Steve Mishu and Brady Rich. And from water, we had Hal Balthrop for a while. He's with NDOT now, and Kimberly Hayes. Kimley Horn with Hawkins Partners as a subcontractor was selected for the project, and we worked with them over this summer and fall to vet the results and fine-tune the study and the presentation that you're about to see. So I'll hand it over to Candace and let her introduce the topic and her team.
All right there. Evening, y'all. So like Dustin mentioned, I'm Candace Key. I'm with Kimley Horn, and we've got our partners back here. So we've got our partners, and we're going to present today just on the result of the study, the stormwater runoff complaints phase 1 study. All right, quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. Just a couple of items related to background. We'll go through a few of the study goals. We'll quickly highlight some of the critical questions and tasks that we were seeking to answer, and then we will roll right into methodology and how we went about completing the study. So we will get into a little bit of a policy review, and we'll talk about that in a few moments here, and then we'll talk about some analysis that we did with the data, some different data that we assessed. So we've got a spatial analysis and a timeline analysis, and we'll get into some conclusions and any questions. For your questions, if you could try to hold your questions until the end, that would be great. But if there's a burning question that really needs to come out, please feel free to interrupt us. There's a few terminology items in here, and if you need some clarification, please let us know so you can keep up, or if you need some more information there. All right, a little bit of background for the study. There's been a perceived increase in frequency and severity of complaints related to stormwater runoff. Over the past, or through 2021 and 2022, there's been approximately 500 complaints that have been logged by Metro Nashville. And so as a part of the study, the question became, are there any underlying causes or factors that we can study and ascertain by looking at the complaints, and what role do regulations play with the complaints? All right, so like Dustin mentioned, this was an effort with 3 different departments with Metro Nashville. So we have codes and building safety, water services, and planning as well. Stormwater is managed through all 3 of these departments. It's maintained, regulated, and managed by all 3. Codes handles the enforcement of codes, and really the enforcement of ISR. We'll talk about that term in a little bit, just to define that. Water services is responsible for maintenance of stormwater infrastructure, and then treatment of impervious areas, added impervious areas, so how that's regulated. And then, of course, planning is responsible on the zoning code development requirement side in formulating the ISR. So that's the different roles that each department plays, and all 3 departments had to come together over the course of this study to help us tackle this analysis and try to get at some underlying causes, if any, that exist for them as drivers behind stormwater complaints. Right, so this study is phase 1. It was originally envisioned that the study would include 2 phases. This is phase 1 of the study, which is really trying to get at what might be causing some of the stormwater complaints and what are some recommendations that we can make or related to policies and regulations. Phase 2, a future phase 2, could include further study and implementation of strategies that were developed during this phase 1 analysis. So we will just be discussing phase 1 today, but keep in mind that there could be, there's just a potential for a phase 2. All right, and the goals of the study were really to complete an analysis of those complaints or the complaints that have been logged from 2021 to 2022. That includes a review of regulations and permitting procedures, and then identifying causes and recommended areas of further study. So we have the project team here behind me. Like I mentioned, I'm Candace Key. I'm with Kimley Horn. Behind me we have Nathan here, Oliver, and he is my leading partner for Hawkins Partners. behind looking at the ordinance review and regulatory review for the study here. All right. So the study itself focused on complaints within 4 hotspot areas. So when we say there are 500 complaints, there have been more than 500 complaints, but within the 4 hotspot areas that we assessed for this study, there are 500 complaints. Those areas are East Nashville, Buena Vista, the Nations, and Green Hills. So keep that in mind as we're going throughout the course of the, letting y'all know what we found today, that we had those 4 areas, and that's really where we were focusing for the analysis. There were 8 critical study questions and 12 total tasks that were assigned to us at the beginning of the study. And really they got at the heart of what is causing the issues. Is there issues with infrastructure and conveyance systems? Are there issues related to infill development? These are all questions that we wanted to ask as we started to assess the data that we had for the study. We also asked, are there changes that are needed to the existing regulations and permitting procedures? And is there anything else that should be studied further, or what should happen for phase 2? All right. So we are going to begin, this is a quick overview of the sections of the presentation that we're going to go to. I'm going to hand things over to Nathan here, and he is going to present on the ordinance benchmarking and peer city review components of the analysis, all related to the regulations. And then we will switch back over to the data assessment. Perfect.
All right, good evening, everybody. As Candace mentioned, my name is Nathan Oliver. I'm with Hawkins Partners. We worked alongside Kimley Horn, and we were really focused on kind of looking at a little bit of the bigger picture, looking at our current ordinances and policies, and then also kind of assessing how we stack up to our peers, and if there's anything we can really take away from that study. So we'll start kind of bigger picture. We'll look at our ordinance and our ordinances and policies, and kind of understand at a high level how they compare to our peers. So we worked alongside Metro Water and Metro Planning to identify 3 peer cities that would really be good studies for this study to better understand how we stack up and if there's anything we can really take away from that comparison. So those 3 cities that were identified are Atlanta, Georgia, Austin, Texas, and Raleigh, North Carolina. Next, we did a review of the Metro Nashville zoning ordinances, applicable stormwater policies, as well as our tree ordinances. We then did the same thing for each of our peer cities. We located any gaps or questions that we had kind of within them, and then we had one-on-one phone calls, sometimes multiple ones, with the peer cities to understand how are the ordinances applied, are there certain things that we are reading that we may not be missing, and understand kind of how they actually work from an application standpoint within the city itself. So just kind of taking a quick look at our peer cities, you'll see Nashville there on the left, looking at kind of our population as we kind of stack up based on 2022, and also understanding if we're looking at stormwater, what are the climate comparisons in terms of the average rainfall. So you'll see Atlanta and Raleigh very close in terms of the amount of rainfall that we see compared to those 2 cities, and then Austin being a little bit more further south and more further west, you'll see is a little bit drier, but again, we all know the similarities that we see when we compare ourselves to Austin in terms of development and policies and regulations. So we started out kind of, like I said, bigger picture, kind of looking at how do we compare us on some key aspects. And the study was really focused on infill development. And so that's kind of where we focused our review as well. There's a lot of information on this chart. We're going to kind of zoom in to a couple specific ones and look at where we actually looked at. So we looked at the ordinances, the Muni Code. We looked at how we compare, or if there is or is not a max ISR for residential districts. How do they or we approach max building coverage? Are there any open space requirements associated with the ordinance? Any on-site retention requirements and what those may be? And are there any other approaches like a regional or district system or alternative compliance that are worth noting within the study? A couple of the key takeaways within this that you'll see, max ISR, which is the impervious surface ratio, so the amount of impervious surface compared to the amount of pervious surface on a particular site. Nashville, regarding those residential districts, we do not have an ISR that's regulated within the zoning ordinance for those. Atlanta is similar, is that they don't have an ISR, but they do, that you'll see below, have a max lot coverage, and we'll get into that in just a minute and what that really means. Nashville, in comparison, has a max building coverage, so it looks at the amount of building area on a site and has a max that's allowed per zoning district within the zoning ordinance. Austin, Texas, and Raleigh both have a residential district max ISR. Austin, in comparison, also has a max building coverage, but Raleigh does not. So they only look at max ISR, but it includes the building coverage. And we'll dig into those details a little bit more here in just a minute. Looking at the on-site retention requirements, which are really looking at what kind of stormwater retention on-site is required. Nashville, and we're going to go into the detail of this and how it applies a little bit more in a few slides, but Nashville is required to capture the first 1 inch of stormwater, 1 inch of rainfall, I should say, and it's broken down into 3 tiers. Atlanta is very similar. They also require the first 1 inch. And that applies to 500 square feet or greater of disturbance of the impervious surface. And then Austin's a little bit different in their stormwater measures are only required at the time of lot subdivision. So if you have an infill lot that you're going in and redeveloping or renovating, there are no stormwater requirements specific to that lot. And then Raleigh takes a slightly different approach where they have a max ISR threshold that applies to different residential zoning districts. And so we'll dive into that too. So the takeaway for this initial analysis is that, as expected, each city utilizes a slightly different set of tools and regulations to address their own stormwater. What we did learn was Nashville's set of stormwater regulations right now that we have in place are very strong compared to our peer cities, and we'll see the evidence of that here shortly. And however, through this study, we've recognized there are opportunities to strengthen those regulations and enhance them at the same time to potentially even achieve some of the goals originally set. So how does Metro Nashville's current infill regulations work? Well, we're set up in a tier system. So if you're below, the numbers on the left correspond to the net impervious area addition on a site. So it looks at how much impervious area based on the existing condition that you have is added to it. So if you're below 800 square feet, there's no treatment requirements. The tier 1, it's called, if you add between 800 and 2,500 square feet, you fall within tier 1 for treatment. Between 2,500 and 8,000, you fall in tier 2 treatment. And then tier 3 captures a net addition of 8,000 to 15,000 square feet. And then if you fall above the 15,000 square feet, you fall into a full plan review. So what this means is, according to the tier that you fall in, dictates what kind of treatment that you would be required to provide. And there's a menu of options that are available for that, and we're going to go through that on the next slide. So if we looked at a current infill site as an example, it's shown here with the purple boundary, and you were an owner or person that was looking at the stormwater for that, Metro Water has this handy sheet that's filled out to determine how much of your impervious area add that you have. From there, you would determine which tier you fall into, and it would tell you how much treatment you would have to provide, and then you would select from the menu of options the way in which you treat that, whether it's a rain garden, whether it's an infiltration trench, whether it's a cistern, or one of the other methods that they have. If we look closer at a specific site example, and this is just a made-up site, but kind of meant to provide a little bit more of a visual example. On the left is representing an existing condition site. So the orange is a building, the green is intended to be some kind of landscape or grass, and then the gray is some kind of driveway, patio, hard surface, impervious surface. So this lot would be representing about 0.15 acres, and it would, according to an R6 zoning that would be used in this example, have a max building coverage of 50%. So in the example that you see there, our max building coverage shown, which is our orange, is actually 29%. And if you look at the impervious area shown, which would be the building in orange, as well as the gray surfaces, we have a 62% impervious area. So that's our existing site. And so in scenario one, the building coverage remains the same at 29%. However, this particular site wishes to add on to their impervious surface. They're gonna add on 750 square feet. That brings their impervious area to 74%. And based on the thresholds and the tiers that we have in our system today, there'd be no stormwater treatment required. In scenario two, that site gets redeveloped. And so we're still going off our existing condition on the left, but in this scenario, there's a house renovation as well as an addition of 750 square feet of impervious surface. The building coverage shown reaches the max allowable within this zoning type, 50%, and the impervious area shown is 74%. Because we are below the 800 square feet of net additional impervious surface, there's no stormwater treatment required. And what this example shows is that a site may be in compliance with the stormwater regulations, but still have a high percentage of impervious area, yet not required any treatment based on the current tiers. So as we start to kind of look at our current treatment system, as well as some of the examples, we start to understand what some opportunities may be that we can look at a little bit closer. So if we dive into the details of our peer cities and look a little bit closer at their regulations, we start to see the ways in which they approach their stormwater requirements and treatment. I'll start off with Georgia. In Atlanta, as we previously stated, they look at lot coverage compared to what Nashville looks at, building coverage. Got an example on the next slide that's going to kind of show this in a little bit more visual way. But their lot coverage accounts for their impervious area. So even though they don't have an ISR, the lot coverage kind of captures their impervious area allowed on a site. Their stormwater department reviews all permits with any ground disturbance. So if there's any ground disturbance whatsoever, that review comes through their department. Now, an interesting discovery was that their residential projects are under the same requirement as their commercial projects. They just have blanket requirements across the board with which they review their projects. One thing that they noted as well is that they have very few variance requests, kind of understanding their process and how their regulations work. One of our questions was, what's your variance process like, and do you see a lot of applications come through? They said that they actually revised this in December 2020 to update the process to make the variance more challenging. And due to that, they have very few variance requests because it's a really stringent process to say, we want to go outside the regulations, we want to submit a variance. So they see a lot of their submittals follow their stormwater requirements. Related to the disturbance amount, so they have a 500 square foot threshold. However, their requirement is anything that removes, adds, or replaces, replaces or adds 500 square feet of impervious. So even if you were going out and wanted to renovate your 500 square foot patio, that would kick in their stormwater treatment requirements. One thing that their stormwater regulations allow for is credit for existing tree preservation. So you can get up to 50% or meet up to 50% of your stormwater requirements through existing tree preservation. And it's something that they encourage during site plan review. So as they're reviewing their regulation or their site plans, they'll look at the existing trees and work with the applicant to see if there's ways that they could possibly keep those, and then you get credit for them. Now, there are requirements for protecting and maintaining those to meet that requirement for them. We also took the opportunity to look at their tree replacement requirements for each city. Atlanta, which is one of the best-known urban tree canopy cities in the country, they have on private property, they have a tree-for-tree replacement requirement. So if you remove a tree, you're required to put a tree back. Now, they don't regulate the size of that tree that has to go back. They just regulate the quantity. However, if that tree is on public property, it's an inch-for-inch replacement. So if you remove a 10-inch tree, then you're required to provide 10 inches back as that replacement. So kind of digging in a little bit more to understand building coverage versus lot coverage. So on the left, we've got an example that represents building coverage. So the gray is representing buildings on a particular site. So this may be a residential structure in a detached garage, for example, and those are the gray buildings. So if we look at building coverage on this site, we have approximately 23% building coverage. Atlanta looks at total lot coverage. So they're looking at the amount of area that is comprised of footprints of structures, driveways, turnarounds, parking spaces, and that even includes patios, decks, sports courts, swimming pools, and similar structures. They're looking at the total coverage of the lot to determine and set their lot coverage per zoning type. This would represent, if you did the calculation for that, 42% lot coverage. In comparison, looking at Austin, Texas, as I mentioned previously, they only require residential stormwater review at time of lot subdivision. So if you're going in and doing a large-scale development that would have a lot subdivision component to it, they would review it for stormwater requirements. They have a lot of detention requirements in Austin, but they don't have any residential infill stormwater requirements. They do have an ISR that applies to their residential zoning, but they don't have anything that triggers or requires stormwater treatment per residential site. They do have an optional stormwater, a regional stormwater management program that you can choose to opt into. It's not a requirement. They do see that apply to these larger scale developments where it works a little bit better based on the development conditions. One thing that was also noteworthy about Austin, Texas is you saw the size, it's a larger population than Nashville, but we all know that they have similar characteristics. They have taken the approach to test and kind of try creative solutions to stormwater challenges that they've seen. One thing that they noted, though, is that their municipal policies are sometimes challenged and don't work as well as they want to because of their state legislators. So there's a little bit of clash between the city and state. Shocking. And something that we can possibly relate to. But one thing that they did say is the approach they've taken is lots of smaller bites. So they have had some policies that have been overruled from the state level. They've kind of taken a step back, they've taken a relook at it, and they've kind of gone back to it through smaller bites and kind of smaller implementation strategies and found success through that. They also noted that they are also working on a strategic stormwater master plan that is currently in process where they're looking to implement some new strategies with that. Austin uses the impervious surface ratio. So again, very similar to lot coverage. Building coverage is represented on the left, and again, just accounts for the building. When we look at impervious surface ratio, they're taking all of these surfaces on a site that would be impervious, again, roofs of structures, patios, driveways, sidewalks, roadways. They even consider parking lots paved or not, or unpaved, so gravel, as an impervious surface, and some decks. You'll see the note at the bottom. So Atlanta's the same way. They look at decks as impervious surfaces. Austin, for example, looks at decks and says they count as 50% impervious cover. So just looking at it in a slightly different way. And then finally, looking at Raleigh, North Carolina, they probably had the most different approach compared to the two in the way that they look at it. So they have a lot distinction for lots established pre-2001 and lots established post-2001. And you can imagine that most of the lots established pre-2001 would fall within the infill development kind of spectrum. And so what they have done is for single-family residential lots of 1 acre or less, they're exempt from city stormwater requirements if they meet an ISR threshold that's set according to the zoning type. And we'll see an example of that in the next page. So they have gone through and they've saying, based on the type of lot, based on the size of it, we're gonna establish an ISR for that particular lot. And if you meet it, then there's no additional stormwater requirements. However, if you have a certain condition or case that doesn't meet it, or you'd like to do alternate compliance, you can go through a more traditional submittal, and you can treat it through volume reduction or treat it through green infrastructure practices. In terms of tree protection, their requirement is you have to protect or retain 10% of existing trees. However, that only kicks in for sites that are 2 acres and larger. So again, for infill development sites, you don't really see that apply very often. They also noted that they have a progressive zoning code that encourages open space through conservation type development strategies. But again, when we're looking at infill development type scenarios, you don't see that apply very much just because of the character of the lot in those specific parcels. So looking at an example of the impervious surface threshold that Raleigh uses, on the left, we've got a smaller infill lot, have an R6 or comparable zoning. It represents approximately 0.15 acres. The structure on it, which is the orange, is a little over 1,100 square feet. Raleigh's max allowable ISR for this particular site would be 51%. So they rely on that percentage to treat their stormwater, saying, based on the amount of ISR we have, we're going to try and treat it through the amount of impervious surface, the amount of pervious surface that you have. Sorry, tongue twister. And then for reference, the building coverage shown here is 24%. And then again, just trying to think back and compare to what we are in Nashville. So Nashville's max allowable building coverage for comparable zoning of R6 would be 50%. And then you would be required to provide the stormwater treatment mechanism depending on how you fell within the tiers and the thresholds there. And then the second example, looking at a little bit larger site, 0.4 acre site, still representative of a lot of infill conditions. The zoning comparison for Nashville would be an RS20. You're looking at approximately a 2,000 square foot house. In Raleigh, they're going to drop that ISR threshold down to 25%. Looking at, again, that kind of comparison of impervious to pervious in terms of stormwater. And that's also what's shown and represented in this graphic. And then in this graphic, it's representing 13% of building coverage. In Nashville, the max allowable building coverage would be closer to 35%, so a much larger structure. But again, you would be required to provide the treatment mechanisms based on the amount of impervious surface add that you would have from your existing condition. So if we were to boil all that down into some key takeaways. So Nashville, we look at max building coverage based on your zoning type. We have a stormwater treatment requirement that's based on a tier system that starts at 800 square feet and goes up to 15,000 to kind of fall within that kind of menu of options that you can pick from. Treatment is based on the net added impervious area. Again, if you remember that example, if you fall below that, you can have a high impervious surface and still no treatment requirement the way that it currently is structured. And so whenever you hit that fall within those thresholds, that's when you look to see what you need to treat. And then again, we have limited impervious surface thresholds for residential, but we look at treating it through those tiers and those mechanisms. So while we don't have it for the specific zoning type, it's treated based on the amount of add for the particular site. And then again, to kind of summarize the key takeaways from the cities, again, Atlanta looks at the lot coverage, which is comparable to an ISR. They look at any disturbance, and then they, if you fall within the 500 square foot threshold of replacement or add, you would be required to treat that. And then they do have that tree preservation credit that would apply to the stormwater requirements. Austin, there's no single family requirement for stormwater, but they do have an ISR. And then Raleigh, again, has those ISR thresholds that they rely on if you want to fall within that structure. And then there's also exemptions possible based on the site-by-site basis and what your unique character is. So kind of looking at the policies and the way that we compare to our peers and looking at our own policies in just greater depth, the question we asked are there opportunities within our own code of ordinances to strengthen the infill development requirements? And so some of the points within that could be studied further is looking closer at the impervious surface ratio related to infill development, if that could be something that could be applied. Looking at adjusting those permit thresholds to find a way to capture some of that impervious surface that could be created based on the existing condition. Are there opportunities to incentivize tree preservation through stormwater credit? And then finally, looking at the building permitting. There's currently a lack of permitting requirements on certain land surfaces, such as sports courts, pool decks and those sorts of things that currently fall outside the building permit that, that we could study closer and better understand other opportunities there to capture that. So from there, I'm going to hand it back to Candace, and we're going to dive into a little bit more of the detail of the specific study.
All right, the data. We won't dive too deeply. We'll just kind of glance over here at some of the results. But we're going to get into the spatial trend analysis and the timeline trend analysis. So taking a look at where the complaints are relative to other complaints and different features within Metro Nashville, that'll be related to the spatial trend analysis. And then we are going to get into a timeline trend analysis. When are storm events happening? When is infill development going on? When are stormwater grading permits active? How does that relate, if does it relate at all, to the complaints that were received from 2021 to 2022? So just some information in terms of background on the data that we took a look at. Had some primary data we're calling it and secondary data, but the primary data that we were looking at and doing the analysis was the stormwater runoff complaints. Had data from 2021 to 2022. Like I mentioned earlier, 500 complaints total within these 4 hotspot areas, and those are the areas we were really focused on. We had infill development permits from 2021 and 2022, again, in those same 4 areas, and also stormwater grading permits as well. Some secondary data that we were also looking at for spatial trends was GIS data. We had parcels that we were looking at, roads, we had zip code areas, swales, stormwater infrastructure, all of those items we were able to take a look at with the stormwater complaints and see where those complaints were falling relative to different stormwater management features within Metro Nashville. We also had rainfall data. We'll get into that for the timeline trend analysis and discuss it a little further. We had population data and building permits that were issued from 2013 to 2023. That was a 10-year period, but wanted to see if we were seeing some relationship there between the permits issued and the complaint. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Wanted to mention some of the limitations of the data. So we had limited tree cover data. It was one of the items we wanted to take a look at, and we just had a limited amount of digitized data available to us. So that was one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the results of the study. Another item that we had some limitations with is the impervious area data that we had throughout Metro Nashville. We actually ended up digitizing quite a bit of data, but really for 2020, 2021, and 2022, we went through and digitized data in targeted locations in drainage areas to observe and see if there were any correlations within those 2 areas. We kind of wanted to break that down into something a little more bite-sized, if you will, compared to trying to hand digitize data through all of Metro Nashville, or at least within the 4 study areas. Finally, we have the complaints themselves, which, as we know, or may not know, but the complaints were user-driven, right? They were reported by citizens of Metro Nashville, and they were user categorized. So we had to remember that as we were going through the analysis, that folks might have been seeing something outside of their house and saying, hey, this might have been due to this, or this might have been due to that, right? And we had to keep that in mind when we were assessing the data and thinking about trends that we were seeing. So that's something of note I wanted to bring up here. All right, a quick overview of the data. Well, a couple of slides here, just overviewing or highlighting some of the overarching themes we were seeing through the data. So we took the complaint data and we categorized it. So we've got about 5 different categories. You're seeing a table here along the top of the table here. You see 5 categories that we put the complaints into. You'll see maintenance, failing infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, creek/stream erosion, and lot to lot. We will get into what lot to lot means in a little bit here, so maybe hold that in the back of your mind. But we took the complaint data and we categorized it into one of these 5 categories. We did that within each study area, and what we found is that most of the complaints that have been submitted, at least from 2021 to 2022, were related to maintenance. We'll get into that. There's another slide here that'll break down the maintenance category even further. But like I mentioned, we saw a lot of information was related to maintenance, or a lot of complaints were related to maintenance. So that is something very interesting to note. All right, further breakdown of maintenance type. We had 3 different categories that we broke the maintenance category into. If complaints seem to be related to sediment, debris, or leaves, we separated that out. So what you'll notice here, click there, is that most of the submitted complaints that were related to maintenance were falling on public property and not private property. So this was just an interesting observation that, there weren't a lot of private issues, but more folks were, at least the folks submitting the complaints were talking about issues that were falling on public property. All right, here's another, more of a picture here. This is what they call a heat map. But what you're seeing here is just for building permits between 2013 and 2023. So that's 10 years of data compared to the 2021, 2022 data that we had for complaints. Well, you'll see here are the number of building permits. And what we did is we normalized that. We took the area. Yes. No, go ahead. Absolutely.
On the type of complaint, you said those complaints were broken down by maintenance and different categories, right?
Yes.
How was that determined?
Got it. Let me go back here. So I think the...
You see maintenance and all the four categories.
Yeah.
How was that determined since you got the data?
Yes. So the question was, and let me repeat, if you don't mind, back your question to make sure I've got it, was how were these categories, or how were the complaints put into these categories? Is that the, yes, okay. Yep, so what we did, we went through the entire database. We had a large, we went through, there was a description of what the complaint was. So we went through those descriptions, and we looked and said, hey, do we think this is related to maintenance? Is this seeming, what is this getting at? And we categorized that way. There was also a column to self-mark what the thought was behind the complaint, so we have that as well, but we wanted to use that in combination with some judgment to see if there was anything that we needed to change. So these numbers shifted slightly. We did one iteration. We did one iteration where we have the raw data, and we had the categories that the complaints were broken up into, and we reviewed the comments and recategorized a few of them accordingly. They seemed to be related to maintenance, for instance, and it was being reported as something else.
I live in my district when the
No worries.
area, although it's kind of a complaint. I don't think my constituents would know which category to put that in. They would just say, like, backyard's flooding.
All right.
So how do you differentiate that from, and now I don't know, maybe some constituents are more detailed than others.
Yeah.
Most of mine would be very vague.
Yeah, they were, some were vague, some were not. So when we were able to,
Sorry,
I apologize.
restate whatever you're answering,
Sure.
because if it's being recorded, they're not picking up anything that's coming from the audience.
Yes.
For the recording purposes, if you
Sure.
can restate.
Absolutely. Yep, so your statement was, if we were trying to be succinct with all that you said there, but your question or statement, secondary question was just how would folks know what category to put complaints under? And so.
Yeah, so if you're in the Nations and I call in and I'm seeing it flooded, how do I know it's locked a lot or failing infrastructure? Because I don't think many people would be able to do that.
Right.
Or did they give that detail? Because mine were.
Yes. So the follow-up question was how would folks know whether something would be maintenance, failing infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, lot to lot, et cetera. And I think the answer is a lot of folks don't, right? So some of this was us going through and kind of categorizing where someone might say, hey, I think that this is flooding. And that might be the categorization that they assigned, right? Like you mentioned, or like it was mentioned earlier, that some folks see, hey, my backyard is flooding, and I think that this is a flooding issue. So we went through those descriptions and kind of did a little bit of a further dive and said, hey, is this flooded related, or is this something that really should be under a maintenance, category? And we did that and arrived at this kind of final tabulation that you see here. Was there another question? Yep.
I think it's the same question. So
Sure.
I continue to hear my backyard is flooding.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
how does that then translate into that's because of sediment? I mean, how does that become a maintenance issue?
I wonder if it might be that when complaints come in, and you might state this, when complaints come in, I mean, our Metro teams are going out and sort of looking at those complaints, and then generally in the data, it would say, we found this culvert blocked, or whatever it might be that was, can you maybe
repeat that into the, yes. So I think your question was in the same lines of how would folks know to, or how would we know to categorize these accordingly if we received a broader complaint. And so to your point, there were some additional categories where folks, Water Service, went out and investigated the complaint after the complaint was filed. And there was some information there about, hey, this appears to be that a drain is blocked or something of that nature. So we were able to utilize that as well to help create the categories. Great. Any more questions on that? Okay, perfect. All right. So this slide here, this picture here is showing the building permits from 2013 to 2023, again, a 10-year period. And this is normalized data, so we took the number of building permits within each of the 4 study areas and we divided that by the total area of the zip code area to get total number of building permits per 100,000 square feet. So what we were doing is normalizing the data. And what we found when we did that was that East Nashville and Buena Vista had the most complaints relative or per 100,000 square feet, and higher numbers of complaints there. And then we've got the Nations following behind that, and then Green Hills. Something to note, the Nations is a larger area, larger square footage, right? And so we're dividing by all of that square footage, although we know a lot of, or a number of the complaints were kind of located over further to the east there. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, the permits, excuse me, the building permits. So we're located further to the east. Right. This slide is showing the complaints, from 2021 to 2022. I apologize for that. Similar process here. We normalized or took the number of complaints within each zip code area, and we took that and we divided it by the total area within each zip code area and got a number of complaints per 100,000 square feet. So again, normalizing the data. The important thing to take away from this slide, or this picture here, is that East Nashville and Green Hills have the most complaints per 100,000 square feet. So you notice that's slightly different from the building permit slide, where we have East Nashville and Buena Vista showing the most building permits per 100,000 square feet. So an interesting distinction to make there. We've got more building permits in those two, but then as we get into the complaints from 2021 to 2022, we have more complaints in East Nashville and Green Hills. All right, so broadly, what does the data say? In total, we had 491 total complaints, just to give a more exact number on that. We have a number of those related to, or majority of those related to what we categorize as maintenance issues. And then we have this term lot to lot, which we will get into in a few slides here. And then we've got about 5%, around 5% related to either failing infrastructure, a lack of infrastructure, meaning no curb and gutter, something of that sort. And then this final category that we've got related to erosion, the creeks and streams. So key takeaways there, maintenance is appearing to be the primary driver, at least from the study, behind complaints. Need for maintenance, it's important to note that can point to capacity limitations. You find if you don't have big enough stormwater pipes, big enough swales, et cetera, to convey flow, you get a lot more issues, maintenance issues arising, leaves, sediment, et cetera, getting caught within the system. So it can also often be indicative of that. The study itself, again, is limited by the data that we had available. We'll talk about that a little bit further in a couple more slides. But overall, it does not appear that the infill development is a significant cause of the 2021 to 2022 complaints. So those are some key takeaways we wanted to highlight up front here. All right. We are going to get in a few more details about the spatial analysis. We're going to describe that lot to lot, or define that lot to lot term, so y'all know what we're talking about there. And then talk about a couple other items, some large scale issues, complaints. We'll talk about watersheds, and we'll talk about impervious area changes. Those were all items that we looked at with the spatial trend analysis. All right, what is this lot to lot thing we keep saying? So a lot to lot issue is a surface drainage issue or issues having to do with the transfer of stormwater from one private property to the next downhill private property. So fully contained on private property. We're not passing through an easement. The flow is going from one property to another. All right, And so one of the first steps that we looked at with our spatial analysis was just looking at where are the complaints relative to each other. And where are the complaints relative to major features within Metro Nashville. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side here, this is a figure. It's of the East Nashville area, and it's called areas of interest. But what we did is we highlighted areas where there seemed to be clusters of complaints, and we looked in those areas to see, okay, what categories are those complaints falling under, and do we think there's any relationship between these complaints that seem to be kind of conglomerating in some areas? And what we found is that a number of complaints were clustered near certain features. Driveway pipes, alleys, lack of areas where there's a lack of infrastructure or swales, those tend to be the areas where complaints were clustering. And what you're seeing on the right-hand side there are really just some boxes drawn around a few clusters in the East Nashville area. And you can see a number of different descriptors here, but getting into the heart of maybe, are those complaints related? So you'll see a couple on there that are related to driveway pipes. It seemed 5 or 6 were related to driveway pipes, things of that nature. But really, they're clustering around certain features. So we found that to be an interesting observation. The next item we took a look at were the lot-to-lot issues and what we're calling large-scale issues. Really, the large-scale issues are 4 complaints that seem to be related to, or the causing factor was a single kind of issue or problem, right? And if that single issue or problem caused 5 or 6 complaints, or if it caused 3 complaints, anywhere upwards of there, we said that was a large to medium scale issue. So what we found overall is that 8 to 21% of the complaints that were received from 2021 to 2022, those were for large or medium scale issues. And we found only a small number, maybe 6 to 8% of the complaints were related to lot issues, the issues that are happening between private properties and waters transferring from one upstream property to the next downstream property. All right, this is what we call a heat map, but this has just our large scale issues, and it has the number of complaints that were impacted by the larger scale issues. So what you're noticing, or what you'll see here on the right, you'll see East Nashville has a couple of areas that have more large scale issues. So what's shown on the screen, I just wanted to note, there are watersheds or drainage areas. We often find with stormwater infrastructure, right, our infrastructure all feeds kind of into a single drainage area, or there are drainage areas that we can pick out. And so that's what's located on the screen. There are these little polygons that are represented there. So we looked by drainage area, and what we saw is there were a few drainage areas where we had more large scale issues or more complainants that were impacted by a large scale issue. So we documented that and had some interesting occurrences within East Nashville where we had more folks have some more complainants being impacted by a singular issue. And in Green Hills as well, you'll see a couple of those as well. All right, so key findings of that density analysis of complaints by watershed, like I mentioned, select watersheds, they exhibited a higher density of complaints. Those watersheds were located primarily in East Nashville, and then Green Hills has a few with higher density of complaints. Although I will note there are some drainage areas in Green Hills, that are a little bit smaller. So you're going to see that the density be a little bit higher for those watersheds because we have those areas because we have some drainage areas that are a little bit smaller. All right, the next item that we looked at was impervious area, in particular impervious area and changes, and are those related to stormwater complaints? And we had some key findings there. So what we did, we mentioned before, we digitized data in a couple of watersheds, but what we found is that changes in impervious area, they generally do not appear correlated to complaints. On the right-hand side, you'll see a figure here. What we did is we tracked changes in impervious in 2021 and 2022, and then looked at the areas where we had complaints, or select areas in a couple watersheds where we had complaints. And we found that there did not seem to be a relationship from this study. In many cases, the complaints were not located near areas where impervious changes or area changes were observed at all. So that was an interesting note, takeaway from the study in those 2 areas. Something else to note here, this is more of what's shown on the screen is a representative snapshot of the 2 areas that we looked at. So like I mentioned, we had quite a few areas where we had complaints and we didn't have changes in impervious area. So this is really a snapshot capturing 6 different areas to kind of be overall representative of what we were seeing when we did this analysis, or this part of the analysis. All right. Finally, we've got the timeline trend analysis. So that was looking at the complaints relative to instances of rainfall events, instances of infill development, or particular while infill development was going on, and while state stormwater grading permits were active. We also wanted to incorporate, and did incorporate, some observations that the Metro staff has had about just related to complaints. Overall, just over time, the volume of complaints, there's been a slight increase in complaints between 2021 and 2022 has been proportionate to population growth. Also, in terms of response times, there's been no consistent increase in maintenance response times for stormwater-related issues, and any periodic increases, they're not due to complaint volume or staffing issues. There's been, equipment and things like that, but they are not related to the volume of complaints. All right, so the first item we looked at from a timeline standpoint were storm events. It would follow that if it rains, we might see a couple of complaints when it rains, and that's exactly what we found. 94% of the complaints were received within 2 weeks after a rainfall event. Next, we took a look at active stormwater grading permits and infill permits. So we're going to define those quickly before we go through what we found when we did that analysis. But a stormwater grading permit, forgive my reading here, but I'll just read that out loud here. A stormwater grading permit is just a permit required for any activity that proposes to change existing site elevations, remove ground cover, or relocate any water course or body of water on a site that is in the floodplain, disturbs over 10,000 square feet of area, or disturbs more than 100 cubic yards of material on the site. So that is a stormwater grading permit. Separate from that is an infill permit. For that permit, it's required for residential development that creates 800 to 15,000 square feet of additional net impervious area, and that's either through new development, redevelopment, or rehabilitation of an existing structure in an existing neighborhood. So those are 2 different distinctions to make there with those types of permits. And looking at those 2 permits, those 2 types, we found that there was no observed correlation between permits and complaints. Infill permits, active permits, we looked at a period of time in which those were effective, and there was no correlation there between the complaints that were happening and the permits that we were seeing from those 2. All right, so this could indicate, and it's important to note that this could indicate the effectiveness of existing regulations for permitted sites. We're not seeing any correlation between those, and that would suggest that the current regulations are doing their job. So we wanted to make the note that there. All right. So overall, we found 3 major contributing factors to the complaints. The first one being maintenance and a need for maintenance due to leaves, sediment, debris, etc. Lack of infrastructure being a second one. We had 10 identified issues related to lack of infrastructure, which meant lack of curb and gutter and in any type of infrastructure to convey the stormwater kind of effectively in the area. And then the final, was capacity limitations. Like I mentioned earlier, usually the need for maintenance or the need for maintenance can indicate a need for increased capacity. So that's a second or third key contributing factor that we found with the study. All right, and just for our conclusions on potential areas of study for phase 2 or potential phase 2, really increased investment or infrastructure investment is a recommendation for phase 2. Review of maintenance, staffing, and funding levels is another one. Until things are upsized or et cetera, reviewing what is being done currently and what funding level is being associated with that could be a potential for phase 2. And then finally, revisiting the ISR, looking at infill permit thresholds, looking at infill permits and complaints, and looking at tree preservation incentives. By doing those things, I feel that for phase two, we could further look at making some enhancements to regulations and policy. All right, with that, are there any additional questions? Oh.
It doesn't, it's not consistent with, District 23, it's very low.
Okay.
And we probably have 100 houses
Mm.
on hills that have increased triple the impervious surface. And if you're below that, if you go to any of those houses and the people below that have greater runoff than they did before.
Mm.
So I wasn't one of those 4 districts.
Okay.
That you had there. But I would imagine topography has a little bit more impact than your suggestion here.
Mm-hmm.
Because nations is flat.
Right.
So you aren't going to get water runoff. In my area, where you're going to have a house on a hill and you triple it and they grade, even though they don't, they say they don't. And they take the trees out, all of a sudden you got the water runoff.
Right.
I think there's a miss there because mine would be maintenance, I would think. I could count 15 people that have counted the new infill as being the problem. So I think there's a little bit of a difference by district. Do you have, I'll lead into, do you have by district the complaints, the type of complaints?
We don't have them by district. Well, we have. Oh, I apologize. So the question was, do we have the complaints by district?
Right.
Correct. Yep.
Classified.
And classified by district.
Right.
Yes.
How many total complaints? You got 500
Yep.
in those 4 districts. How many total complaints in the 35 districts?
Yes. I apologize for that because I don't have the number on the top of my head for, total number of complaints. We don't have them categorized by district quite yet. We just went within these 4 areas and categorized them accordingly. Now, presumably we could go in and quickly categorize those by district, but we don't have the entirety of all of the complaints received categorized by district through all of Metro Nashville.
And I think topography is
Yeah,
going to
absolutely.
be the difference maker in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
Flat topography is not going to really make a difference.
Right.
Because the house-to-house runoff is a big issue. And Green Hills, West Mead, Hillwood, is going to make a difference.
Right,
And
right.
we see that physically, it's anecdotally, you just see it run off right into another house.
Yeah.
So I think there's a miss on that. In terms of some of the issues.
Absolutely, and we did, and the question was, or the statement was related to topography, that there would be obviously some impact of topography on, the situation with the complaints and, categorizing the complaints. We did look at topography kind of from a general overview. We had some data on that and looked in a couple areas, and we're seeing some where we saw those elevation changes, some correlation there, like you mentioned, right? If you're uphill here, you've got a significant hill, right? You're going to see more of the flow coming down. In our attempt, our drainage areas, we're going to attempt somewhat to capture that, or the watersheds, if you will, is to say, hey, by topology, we would expect all of this to kind of come together and that to come together and get a sense there. So that was kind of our loose trying to capture that. But we did try to take a look in some areas of topology as well, but outside of this. Exactly. Yes. Absolutely. Right.
So I don't think that takes into some of the impact of some of the impervious.
Yes, and would this be a good?
I was just saying, could you just restate what you're saying is the code?
I apologize for, can folks just walk up and hit the button?
They can.
Oh, that would be great. If they could, yeah. Would you mind? Yeah. You're the guest of honor there. Please. No, that's perfect. Would you mind repeating? Yep, you got to hit is there a button there that he can?
There we go. So really checking, the question is, are out of impervious surface in a topography where it's hillier? And there's triple the impervious surface on a house that was just built. So the people below that on the hill will get the water runoff.
Right.
We realize that the 100 square foot threshold, but as you see from an anecdotal perspective, there's greater runoff. Right. And with that accumulates as you take that, as you go downstream.
Right.
And so you get to the houses at the bottom of this and it accumulates and it's now impacting their yards.
Right. Yep.
So the question is, how does this study take that into account? Because Nations, for example, is very flat. So it wouldn't
Right.
clearly show the same, the maintenance would probably be the reason. But in terms of house to house, I think you're looking at in areas like Westmead, Hillwood, Green Hills, you're probably looking at it probably a more impactful from a house to house, because development in the last 5 years has gone crazy, and it's all increased the impervious surfaces, or there's no trees in some cases. So the water's got to be running off. You can see it, and so I just wonder, because you're really suggesting it's more of a maintenance issue and not an infill house to house issue, and that's not what we're seeing anecdotally.
Got it. Yeah. Yep. And and I think I mentioned partially in the response there, I'll just repeat it back again.
Sure.
That we did take a high level look at topology and looked at changes in slope, et cetera, and tried to, with the drainage areas, capture a bit of that. Like you mentioned, right, as water accumulates, it runs downhill. So we tried to at least look for where there's steep elevation changes and things of that nature, and could we find some areas. So some of the large scale issues that we identified, which I can actually pop back to that slide. I'm doing this in a slightly difficult way, right? But we can see there's some areas in Green Hills, for instance, where we have we're saying they're large scale issues, but those are some of the items that we were trying to capture there of, hey, it seems in these drainage areas, we've got some issues going on that we're kind of centralizing, around drainage area. And there's some steep slopes in certain areas, and there were some pockets there in East Nashville too. So we tried to capture that. We kind of took a high level look at that. But I do agree, topology does play a role.
And going back to Atlanta, I lived in Atlanta for quite a while. They're very similar in topography as we are.
Yeah.
And so you start to look at, they're using 500 feet versus our 800 feet, and they're allowing trees for a partial benefit. Had you looked at Atlanta a little closer to see possibly what we could glean from them?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to? I'll let Nathan field that one.
Yeah, a couple of the other things that we kind of mentioned that were differences is that they review all disturbance. So any kind of land disturbance that they have on site goes through the review process, and then if it meets that 500 square feet, and you have to remember that's replacement or addition. So if you're even replacing your driveway that's currently existing and been there for 50 years, you would have to then treat that. So they do have a little bit different way in which they approach it, and they also have a lot more review that they do because everything comes through their department. And so they do have a little bit larger department too, that accounts for that review. But those are kind of the key differences that we were seeing with them.
So do you think that's very similar to what we should be looking at, since they have a great tree canopy and they're known for that?
I think we all know the benefits of an existing tree canopy and kind of what they could do for stormwater. Obviously, it has to go through the right protection measures to kind of see that the value from that. It's certainly a tool that could that obviously Atlanta uses for stormwater. That they also see it see the benefit of that. I mean, Tree City has been kind of noted. And then I think the other aspect of it is just looking at the examples that we showed. You could have a high impervious percentage on your site. Again, that's looking at the existing condition, but you could have a high amount of impervious surface on the site and not have to provide it as long as you fall within the current thresholds that we have. So their mechanisms do look at it in a little bit different way.
Okay, thanks. Last question I have is, within the scope of your project, can we get by zip code or district the complaints and where it's and the breakdown of the problem with the complaint or the methodology in the complaint?
By district?
Yeah, by district.
That'd be a question. The current state doesn't have that, like I mentioned.
I didn't know if you already have the general data, if you could then apply it, because then I'd love to know how that got applied to my district, because I have a good record of the complaints.
Yeah, that's fair. It's public. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So we can.
It's within the scope. Okay.
Oh, if we can provide the breakdown of complaints by district, is what he's asking.
Yeah, we can provide you that. That's public information.
Okay, great. That would be helpful, because, like I said, a lot of people go through me than Tom, and so I already have a pretty good record of what the complaints are. So I'd be able to cross compare what you're seeing and what I'm seeing. Okay. Thanks.
That'd be good. Perfect.
Thank y'all so much for this information.
Absolutely.
I've also heard from a large group of people, and I would echo what Councilmember Druffel is saying there. I'm encouraged that we're talking about trees. Is it possible, without even further study, to talk about and possibly add to our current stormwater manuals list of, I mean, there's supposed to be a menu of you can do this grassy swale or that. And I was on the infill committee when we came up with those thresholds. And at the time, we just didn't have the data to figure out what tree, either retention or additions, could be part of that menu. But I'm thinking if Atlanta's figured it out, can we go ahead and add that to the stormwater manual now, even before we do any further study, just because there must be data now that says this size tree of this type of tree can help you retain the first 1 inch of rain. Does that exist? Now, that would be one question. Oh, yes.
How do you feel?
So currently in the infill ordinance, there is tree credit. You do have the option of doing a tree credit. It's just due to the size of the lot and what is being proposed on the lot, as it was mentioned in the presentation today, there is no impervious surface ratio. So when we were developing the infill guidelines, we did our own study with builders at the table, and they told us we're going to clear the whole lot. And so, but there is a tree credit that is already a part of the infill regulations. It's up to a certain percentage of the net impervious area that they can account for. There are qualifying trees. We do not consider Bradford or ash, but there are a host of qualifying trees. If you do want to consider those, there is a process that you have to go through to make sure that that tree is alive, that tree is well. It has to be protected during the construction phase. It has to have tree protection fencing around it, and it has to be alive at the end of the process. If it found that it is a dead tree, it does have to be replaced at the diameter that it was when it was there. So that's already in place. It's just not utilized because there's no incentive to utilize it. And if you don't have things like impervious surface ratio, like some of the other cities, or lot coverage, you have the infill processes that are having to try to mitigate the amount of impervious that's on the site. So you might, where other cities may have a threshold, we're above that threshold, and you having to have infill practices to try to meet those thresholds, where it was never meant to do. It's only supposed to be capturing and treating the first 1 inch of runoff.
Thank you.
I'm glad to get that on the record. And then my second question is, my understanding, and maybe I can get educated further on this one as well, when we created that process, we said if you add 800 square feet, then it triggers these. But if you do your addition and then you come back the next year and put in a driveway, there's not necessarily a paving or a permit process for certain types of paving, and so nobody knows that you then have added another 400 square feet, and now you're over the threshold. Did we fix that, or is that still an issue, and is that something we could fix in the short run?
She's walking right back. Yeah.
Just have a seat up here with you.
Yeah. I'm just gonna sit right there.
Well, it's hit or miss with driveways for existing houses. The process is they are supposed to go through NDOT for evaluation, but many times that does not happen. What we're experiencing as far as infill, we could have a project that was permitted 5 or 6 years ago. They come back, we're evaluating, now they're doing an addition. Now that addition is compromising the mitigation practice, and we have to go through a whole nother review. And then we have to capture the driveway, the sports court, the outdoor kitchen, the pool and the pool decking. Those are the things that we've been dealing with extensively on new and former infill sites. So we're having to use the practices, like I say, sports courts, you know, tennis, pickleball, basketball, those things do not require a permit right now. And they are being proposed quite a bit in our city.
Yeah, it's one of the things that came up as we were trying to.
Don't go away. And so I guess my question is there a way that working with the building community, we could just say, let's create some really easy, not onerous notification process so that we can catch it when it happens instead of 4 years later when you're coming back from some other reason. And that, again, I'm just saying that I know that people freak when you create another permit requirement, but is there a low barrier way to do that?
I think that is part of the study that we really looked at, saying we think there's opportunities there, and we really need to look at it further to figure out the most effective way to implement something like that. And working with Kimberly and her department to understand what we did was identify, okay, there's some potential things we can look at. We really need the phase 2 to really dive into those to understand what are the challenges and what are the ways that we can make sure that we are actually implementing something that is effective. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you. Great, thank you for your question. Are there any other? Yes, perfect.
Thank you all for the study and the presentation. I had a couple of questions relating to, I guess, like at what point does the stormwater requirements like intervene with the planning process? And I mean, I think it's obviously going to be different if like a project is like a by right zoning project, they'll submit plans, and then at some point then there's also like an SP process for specific projects. My question is just, I talk with a lot of folks who are working on projects, and one of the issues that they run into is like when they get to the stormwater process, once the regs are applied, they're being asked to do something that's like very difficult for them to accomplish. And so, did y'all look at when that first intervention is, kind of how other cities do that, like the first review of that? Like, is there any room to maybe catch some of this on the front end before folks do a bunch of engineering and in some cases a big complicated SP that then all of a sudden might be difficult to implement once it hits the stormwater regulations?
Do you mind if you're gonna, yeah.
So talking through at Lisa Milligan Metro Planning, so talking through the SP process, and especially with bigger SPs, generally on the front end, they're asked to show that there is enough room sort of on the site to provide the needed stormwater infrastructure. But because of the way that the SP process works, preliminary SPs are not as detailed as final SPs, which is when they're doing the actual construction drawings and actually getting into the engineering. We will at times, if it's a challenging site or if there is topography, we will ask for additional details on the front end. Sometimes the applicants or developers aren't far enough along that they're able to provide that, and so they'll say, we'll wait till the final site plan. And so we will ask along with stormwater for additional information on the front end, but a lot of the times the applicants would like to put that to the final site plan. The engineers that they work with on the preliminary SPs are sometimes different than the engineers that they work with on the final site plans. And so I don't know how you sort of mitigate that issue of when the real engineering is done, you're often going to see that there are going to be changes. And we try to just manage that through the final site plan process working with stormwater.
Thank you. And that's helpful.
Sorry, a quick note, if I can, for City of Atlanta, for instance. I think you mentioned, is there some process? There's something called a conceptual stormwater meeting, and that's something that happens, and there's a good level of engineering that, comes with that. So it's a part of the requirements there. They're a little stringent on the process, but there's that concept meeting that happens probably 30% plans or something like that, right? That's happening then, and is allowing some things to be caught. So that's one kind of, at City of Atlanta kind of comparison there. That could be made and has been somewhat effective in that regards.
Excellent. That's helpful, and that kind of leads into my next question, which was like the other thing that I often hear from folks on the builder side is like, they're not being asked to do something they didn't expect, but they perceive a long time that it's taking for grading permits to be issued for the review process for all the review. So I wondered, like, you talked about Atlanta and you mentioned like the staffing levels and the capacity of their review department briefly. Did y'all spend much time looking at the capacity of the different peer cities versus Nashville in terms of stormwater staff? Like that sounds like a great idea to have that 30% plan, you know, conceptual review, but like, I have a feeling if we put that on the team that we have now with the size that it is, you know, that would, they would not like it. It would be asking them to do a lot more. So I guess what I'm asking is like, how do we compare to these other cities? If you can flesh that out a little bit more in terms of like the staff we have dedicated to this function.
Yeah, we didn't look at that detail in terms of like departmental size, as compared to our peer cities. What I will say is, part of that phase two, like if we were going to look at potentially adjusting the thresholds or potentially looking at an ISR, those sorts of things, I think a part of that would go along with it to say, how does this change the permitting process, and how does this change the volume to make sure that whatever we're implementing is able to be implemented on the metro side, and then the value seen on the public side. And so that kind of level of detail would come with that phase two of really understanding how that policy can be applied and kind of managed internally. I will note, like, Atlanta's got a really stringent review process. What we heard a lot from Austin was they're understaffed, they have a lot of vacancies, everything takes a long time, and everyone that we wanted to talk to had either moved or been reassigned within like the past year. So it was a very interesting kind of information that you kind of, that we gathered just from kind of that interview process with them. So it's not that, you know, they're obviously seeing a lot of development too, and so the challenges that kind of come with that. But I would very much say that that phase two would take on that level of detail, for sure.
Yeah, and just for context, so what was authorized was this phase one, and when you talk about phase two, that would be like an additional, like y'all going out and doing more work?
Looking at more of the strategies that could look at those things that we noted, like those different tools that we said in there could be ways that we could even strengthen the ordinance. That would kind of look at that in a much greater detail, whereas right now we were just kind of looking at what do we have today and how do we compare.
Thank you. And then my last question, on lot-to-lot issues, this is, you know, not public easements, not public infrastructure between two lots. Do any of the cities you looked at do a better job of addressing that, or like having tools to address that? Because like a lot of times it's, you know, new construction that causes the issues, and it's not necessarily that there's not the impervious surface, it's that somebody designed the downspouts to where they just dump into the neighbor's yard, or, you know, something like that. So did y'all find any city really does a good job of addressing lot-to-lot issues, like within neighborhoods is mostly what I'm talking about, like residential areas?
That's a tough nut. A lot of folks say the same thing, right? Of, hey, what can we do to combat this, right? And it becomes hey, this is a private property, you know, between private properties, and there's not, you know, like you said, other than the regulation side. So there haven't been great tactics, I know, in the Atlanta area and others to be able to combat that, because you're dealing with that. This is private in between, you know, between neighbors, if you will, right? Versus, you know, the regulations, and we're requiring these things, like you mentioned, somebody turned the downspouts. I know there's a lot of folks, you know, if something's turned the wrong way or something, it's a matter of you not installing something correct, you know, that's different, right? Relative to, hey, you know, common enemy law down here in the South in terms of water, right? We got to get rid of it, you know? So there's a tricky balance there. I know that wasn't a direct answer, but.
Yeah, I mean, it is complicated. I mean, the downspouts are pointing the right way for the person who pointed them at their neighbor's property, you know, so. Okay, well, thank you. That is challenging. Thank you all so much for the presentation. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Great. Were there any other questions? All right. Well, I think that will do it. We'll conclude here. Thank y'all so much for listening. If there are any follow-up questions, I believe those could be submitted. I know we're recording Dustin here. They could go towards Dustin and get directed accordingly. So thank you so much for the time.
I think, is there a plan for a second phase from the planning department?
I think that's kind of what we wanted to gauge with phase one and the direction for that. So that's definitely a conversation we want to have going forward.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.